Robert Edward Lee's name carried extraordinary weight in the United States of the 19th century. He was not only the leading general of the Confederate States Army, but also the descendant of one of Virginia's oldest families. Born in 1807, Lee was the son of Revolutionary War hero Henry "Light Horse Harry" Lee and Anne Hill Carter. Through his marriage in 1831 to Mary Anna Randolph Custis, he tied the Lee bloodline directly to the Custis and Washington families, since Mary was the only surviving child of George Washington Parke Custis, the step-grandson and adopted heir of President George Washington. This union produced 7 children, each of whom inherited not only their parents' lineage, but also the heavy burden of their father's fame and the consequences of a war that reshaped the nation. The Lee children grew up at Arlington House, the great mansion on the Potomac that overlooked the capital city of Washington. It was a site steeped in history. Built by George Washington Parke Custis as a shrine to his famous step-grandfather, the estate was filled with relics of the Revolution, paintings, and heirlooms of America's first president. Life at Arlington before the war was that of an elite Virginia household. The children received private education, instruction in literature, religion, and music, and they were surrounded by the expectations of a planter aristocracy. Their father, often absent due to military assignments, wrote affectionate letters home, guiding their moral and religious formation. Their mother, Mary, instilled a deep sense of duty, faith, and family loyalty. Yet even before the war, challenges loomed. Mary Custis Lee suffered from chronic rheumatoid arthritis, a condition that worsened over the years, leaving her daughters with increasing responsibilities in managing the household. The family's privileged world collapsed with the secession of Virginia in 1861. Arlington House was abandoned as the Union Army occupied the grounds and turned them into a military headquarters, and later Arlington National Cemetery. The Lees became exiles, moving among relatives' homes and wartime refugees. The children, then in their late teens and 20s, had to adjust rapidly from lives of comfort to an existence marked by displacement, loss, and the constant absence of their father. They each responded differently, some with military service, others with nursing and quiet resilience, others with attempts to carve independent paths after the war. One major fact that shaped the post-war fate of the family was the government seizure of Arlington. The estate was confiscated by the US for failure to pay taxes, and by 1864, burials of Union soldiers had begun on the grounds to ensure the property could never serve as a home for the Lees again. This act permanently severed the family from its ancestral home and defined the material circumstances of the children's futures. While the Custis inheritance provided some financial resources, particularly after a post-war settlement, the destruction of Arlington marked the symbolic loss of the family's foundation. Each of the 7 Lee children, therefore, carried into adulthood the legacy of a revered but defeated father and the permanent absence of the home that had shaped their youth. A rare but notable detail about the Lee family before the war is that the daughters, particularly Annie and Agnes, received a broader education than many young women of their class. While typical Southern gentry daughters were prepared for marriage and social duties, the Lees emphasized reading, journaling, and moral reflection. Agnes kept a diary between 1850 and 1855 that recorded not only family activities, but also visitors such as Washington Irving, offering historians an unusually intimate portrait of elite Virginia domestic life. These writings became essential later for understanding the private world of Robert E. Lee's household, and they demonstrated that the children were not merely passive participants in their father's story, but recorders and shapers of family memory. A debated point among historians is the degree to which Robert E. Lee's children embraced or rejected the Confederate legacy after the war. Some, like Rooney and Robb Jr., took active steps to reintegrate into American civic life. Rooney served as a U.S. congressman, while Robb wrote memoirs that humanized his father and placed him within the nation's historical narrative. Others, such as Mary Custis Lee, maintained a more distant, even defiant stance, refusing to conform to traditional roles or to participate in the reconciliation culture of the late 19th century. Scholars differ on whether this reflected personal disposition, disillusionment with the Confederacy, or broader currents of post-war Southern identity. What remains clear is that the Lee children were not a monolithic group. Their lives reflected different strategies for surviving the aftermath of war and the weight of a famous surname. From the heights of Arlington House to the scattered lives they led after 1865, the story of Robert E. Lee's 7 children illustrates the collision between personal destiny and national upheaval. They were born into one of the most prominent families in America, educated to assume places of honor and duty, but their adult lives unfolded in the shadow of defeat and in the ruins of a vanished world. The narrative of each child, Custis, Mary, Rooney, Annie, Agnes, Robb, and Mildred, forms a chapter in the larger story of how families of the Confederate elite adapted to Reconstruction, memory, and modernity, and it is through their paths, divergent as they were, that the legacy of Robert E. Lee moved beyond the battlefield into the fabric of American history. George Washington Custis Lee, the eldest of Robert and Mary Lee's 7 children, was born on September 16, 1832, at Fort Monroe in Virginia. Named for his maternal grandfather, George Washington Parke Custis, he was heir not only to the Lee family's distinguished military tradition, but also to the Washington Custis lineage that connected him directly to America's first president. From the outset, Custis, known in the family simply as Boo, was expected to embody discipline, duty, and leadership. These expectations shaped his education and career and remained with him long after the Civil War. Custis was a gifted student and, by all accounts, a quiet and serious young man. He attended local schools before securing an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Following in his father's footsteps, he excelled there, graduating first in his class in 1854. This achievement was not merely academic. It marked Custis as one of the most promising officers of his generation. After graduation, he was commissioned into the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, an elite assignment that reflected both his abilities and his family name. His early military career included work on fortifications and other engineering projects, which were central to the Army's responsibilities in the mid-19th century. The secession crisis of 1861 forced Custis, like his father, into a life-altering decision. He resigned his U.S. Army commission and joined the Confederate service. During the war, he served primarily in Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital. Appointed aide-de-camp to President Jefferson Davis, Custis functioned less as a battlefield commander and more as a military advisor and planner. Still, he saw combat in the desperate final days of the conflict. In April 1865, at the Battle of Sailor's Creek, he commanded troops defending Richmond and was captured by Union forces. His imprisonment was brief, but it marked him as one of the last Confederate generals to be taken in the war's closing days. After the Confederacy's defeat, Custis Lee returned to civilian life in a drastically altered Virginia. In 1871, he succeeded his father as president of Washington College in Lexington, which was soon renamed Washington and Lee University in honor of General Lee. Custis served in this role for 26 years, until 1897. His tenure as president was characterized by a conservative approach. He sought stability and continuity, focusing on maintaining the institution's reputation and preparing young men for responsible roles in society. While not remembered as a transformative leader, he preserved the college during a difficult period and ensured that the Lee family name remained tied to higher education in the South. One of the most significant episodes of Custis Lee's post-war life was his legal battle to reclaim the Arlington estate. After the Union Army occupied Arlington in 1861, the US government had declared it seized for unpaid taxes. In 1874, Custis filed suit against the federal government, arguing that the seizure had been unlawful. The case, United States versus Lee, reached the Supreme Court in 1882. In a landmark 5-4 decision, the court sided with Custis, ruling that the property had indeed been taken illegally. This meant that, on paper, Custis regained ownership of Arlington, which by then had become Arlington National Cemetery. Given the sacred role the grounds now played as the final resting place for thousands of Union soldiers, Custis chose not to disturb it. Instead, in 1883, he accepted a settlement of $150,000 from the government, a substantial sum at the time and one of the few material compensations the family received for its losses during the war. An overlooked detail about Custis Lee's life is his reputation for shyness and privacy. Unlike his father, who was often surrounded by admirers, or his younger brother Rooney, who thrived in political and social circles, Custis preferred solitude and scholarly pursuits. He never married, and he left no descendants. He lived for many years with his siblings, particularly with Rooney's family at their estate of Ravensworth, near Alexandria. He also attended Confederate veterans' reunions, where he was respected as both the son of Robert E. Lee and as a Confederate general in his own right, though he rarely sought attention. Historians have debated Custis Lee's effectiveness as president of Washington and Lee University. Some argue that his cautious leadership style kept the school from advancing as dynamically as it might have under a more visionary president. Others counter that. In the unstable years after Reconstruction, his steady, conservative management was precisely what the institution needed. Regardless of these interpretations, his long tenure demonstrated the continuing influence of the Lee family in Southern education. Custis Lee's death came on February 18, 1913, in Alexandria, Virginia, at the age of 80. He was the last surviving Confederate general of the Lee family. His passing closed a direct generational link to the antebellum gentry of Virginia and the world of his grandfather Custis, the adopted son of George Washington. He was buried in the family crypt at Lexington, where he joined his parents and siblings. The life of George Washington. Custis Lee illustrates the weight of legacy in 19th century America. He was the son who most visibly carried the combined heritage of the Washingtons, the Custises, and the Lees. His career, though quieter and more reserved than some of his siblings, ensured that the Lee name remained bound to both the Confederacy's memory and the educational institutions of Virginia. Through his Supreme Court case, he also left a permanent mark on American constitutional law, one that continues to be cited in discussions of property rights and government authority. His reserved nature contrasted with his public responsibilities, but in both spheres, he remained true to the values of duty and continuity instilled by his family. Mary Custis Lee, the second child of Robert E. Lee and Mary Anna Randolph Custis, was born on July 12, 1835, at Arlington House. She carried her mother's name and, from childhood, bore both the privilege and the responsibility of being the eldest daughter of one of Virginia's most prominent families. Mary's life unfolded in ways that often defied the expectations of her era. She remained unmarried, traveled extensively across the globe, and became an eccentric figure in the post-war South. Her independence, both admired and criticized, set her apart from her siblings and earned her a unique place in the Lee family's story. During the Civil War, Mary, like her sisters, aided the Confederate cause by sewing clothing, volunteering in hospitals, and enduring the dislocations of wartime life. She stayed close to her mother, who was largely incapacitated by arthritis, and assisted with household management during the family's displacement from Arlington. With the fall of their home and the Union's confiscation of the Custis Lee estate, the family endured reduced circumstances. But Mary, even in wartime, exhibited a restless spirit and a determination not to be bound by convention. Following her father's death in 1870, Mary's life took a different trajectory from that of her siblings. She inherited a substantial portion of the settlement money paid to the Lee family after her brother Custis's Supreme Court victory in the Arlington case. With these funds, Mary had financial independence, a rare advantage for an unmarried woman of the 19th century. Beginning in the 1870s, she launched into extensive world travel, often alone or with companions, but always on her own terms. Her journeys spanned Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. She visited England, where she was granted an audience with Queen Victoria. In Rome, she met Pope Leo XIII. She travelled to the Holy Land, sailed up the Nile in Egypt, explored India and Ceylon, present-day Sri Lanka, and ventured as far as Japan and Australia. Mary's wanderings were widely noted in newspapers and in the recollections of those who met her abroad. Her identity as Robert E. Lee's daughter opened many doors in aristocratic and diplomatic circles, and she became something of a celebrity in expatriate society. A lesser-known but striking episode in Mary's life occurred in 1902 in Alexandria, Virginia. At the age of 67, she was arrested for refusing to comply with segregation laws on a local streetcar. She had chosen to sit beside her African-American maid in the section reserved for white passengers. When asked to move, she refused. Her arrest caused a sensation in Virginia newspapers. Some hailed her defiance as a protest against unjust laws, while others dismissed it as the stubbornness of a difficult personality. Historians still debate whether her act was a conscious stance against segregation or a refusal to be told where to sit. Regardless of intent, the incident was remarkable. Decades before Rosa Parks, the daughter of the Confederacy's most famous general was arrested for disregarding Jim Crow laws. Mary's independence came at a cost to her family relationships. She never married and did not remain close to her siblings in their later years. She often lived abroad for years at a time and was absent at several family funerals, including those of her parents and sisters. Her younger sister Mildred once complained that Mary left us to bear our sorrow alone. Such comments reflected the perception that Mary was distant, even insensitive, to the family's emotional needs. Yet to others, she appeared as a woman who valued freedom above conformity and who refused to confine herself to the expectations placed upon daughters of the Southern gentry. The debated aspect of Mary's legacy centers on her motivations. Was she a progressive spirit ahead of her time, rejecting social constraints and quietly challenging segregation? Or was she simply eccentric, guided by personal stubbornness and a desire for novelty rather than principle? Biographers have reached differing conclusions. What is clear, however, is that her life does not fit neatly into the mold of the dutiful Southern woman. She charted her own course in an era when few women could. Mary Custis Lee lived into the 20th century, long enough to witness the world transformed by industrialization and global conflict. She was the last surviving child of Robert E. Lee, dying on November 22, 1918, at Hot Springs, Virginia, only days after the end of World War I. She was 83 years old. With her death, the direct generation of Lee's children came to an end. Her passing, just as the old world collapsed in war and revolution, underscored the immense span of history she had witnessed, from the antebellum South to the dawn of modern America. The life of Mary Custis Lee highlights both continuity and departure within the Lee family. She shared her siblings' devotion to their parents and their Confederate loyalties during the war, But her later independence set her apart. She refused marriage, embraced global travel, and even defied segregation laws. While her choices sometimes alienated her family, they also preserved her individuality. Through her, the Lee legacy extended beyond Virginia plantations and battlefields to the far corners of the world. William Henry Fitzhugh Lee, known universally as Rooney, was born on May 31, 1837, at Arlington House, the third child and second son of Robert E. Lee and Mary Anna Randolph Custis. From the beginning, Rooney embodied many of the traits that distinguished his family: physical presence, charm, and a strong sense of duty, but also carried a lighter, more easygoing spirit than his elder brother Custis. His father once joked that Rooney was too large to be a man, too small to be a horse, and might need a tight rein to keep him in line. That combination of warmth and restlessness would define his life. Rooney's education began under private tutors and later took him north, where he attended Harvard University. For a young Virginian of his background, studying in Massachusetts was an unusual step, but it gave Rooney a brief taste of Northern society. He quickly became popular among his peers, remembered for his humor and easy manner. Still, he showed little interest in academic rigor and left without completing a degree. Instead, he turned to the military, a path shaped by family tradition. With the help of General Winfield Scott, he secured a commission in the U.S. Army in 1857. Rooney served with the 6th U.S. Infantry during the Utah Expedition, a campaign intended to assert federal authority over Mormon settlements. He performed his duties competently, but found peacetime soldiering dull. By 1859, he had resigned, preferring to return to Virginia and the life of a planter. That same year, Rooney married Charlotte Wickham, a member of another prominent Virginia family. Their union was celebrated by both families and seemed to promise a stable domestic future. Rooney's maternal grandfather, George Washington Custis, gifted the couple the White House plantation on the Pamunkey River, a historic estate once tied to Martha Washington's family. There, Rooney set about establishing himself as a gentleman farmer, with Charlotte and their children at the center of his life. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 shattered that vision. Rooney joined the Confederate Army and quickly found a place in the cavalry under General J.E.B. Stuart. Brave and decisive, he rose to command the 9th Virginia Cavalry and later attained the rank of Major General. Rooney fought in many of the Army of Northern Virginia's major engagements, including the Peninsula Campaign, Antietam, and Chancellorsville. He was wounded at the Battle of Brandy Station in June 1863, the largest cavalry battle of the war, and while recovering at his in-laws' home, he was captured by Union forces. He spent nearly a year as a prisoner of war in Fort Lafayette, New York, before being exchanged in early 1864. The war exacted a devastating personal toll on Rooney. In 1862, Union troops burned White House Plantation. His young son, Rob, named for his grandfather, died of typhoid fever during the chaos. His wife, Charlotte, died in 1863, while Rooney was still imprisoned, and 2 more of their children succumbed to illness during the conflict. By Appomattox, Rooney had lost his home, his wife, and all of his children. Few among the Lee family suffered more personal tragedy during the war years. After the Confederacy's defeat, Rooney attempted to rebuild a semblance of normal life. He returned to the White House estate, restored what he could, and resumed farming. In 1867, he remarried, choosing Mary Tabb Bolling, a Virginian from another distinguished family. With her, he found happiness and stability. Together they had 6 children, ensuring that the Lee line would continue. Their household, filled with evening prayers, family rituals, and the genteel traditions of Virginia society, carried echoes of Arlington House before the war. Rooney did not remain confined to private life. By the 1870s, restrictions on former Confederates in politics had eased, and he entered public service. He was elected to the Virginia Senate and later to the U.S. House of Representatives as a Democrat, representing Virginia's 8th District from 1887 until his death. His election marked a remarkable reversal. Less than a generation after he had taken up arms against the United States, he swore an oath to the Constitution and served in the very capital where his father had once fought against Union forces. His congressional career was marked by moderation. He advocated for Virginia's economic recovery and supported measures to modernize agriculture and improve infrastructure. A little-known detail about Rooney's post-war life is his role as a preserver of the Custis Lee estates. Alongside his brother Rob, he worked to maintain what remained of the family's lands and traditions. Rooney often hosted extended relatives and was remembered for his hospitality at the rebuilt White House estate. Veterans of the Confederate cavalry frequently visited, recalling his leadership and camaraderie. Historians debate Rooney's place in Virginia's Reconstruction-era politics. Some view him as emblematic of the New South moderate who sought to balance reconciliation with loyalty to Southern traditions. Others argue he was a conventional ex-Confederate planter politician whose influence was modest compared to his father's towering legacy. Regardless, his election to Congress underscored the degree to which former Confederate leaders and their families were reintegrated into national life by the late 19th century. Rooney's later years were marked by steady public service and family devotion. He died on October 15, 1891, at Ravensworth, his wife's family estate, at the age of 54. At the time of his death, he was still serving in Congress. His body was taken to Lexington, Virginia, and interred in the Lee family crypt, close to his parents and siblings. Of all Robert E. Lee's sons, Rooney perhaps best embodied continuity between the antebellum world and the post-war United States. He experienced the highs of Virginia's planter elite, endured the tragedies of war and personal loss, and ultimately reintegrated into American political life. Through his children with Mary Tabb Bowling, the Lee line continued into the 20th century, ensuring that Robert E. Lee's descendants would remain part of American society long after the Confederate banners were folded away. Among Robert E. Lee's 7 children, 3 daughters, Annie, Agnes, and Mildred, lived lives that were often quieter than their brothers, but they were central to the family's history. Their stories were marked by duty, sacrifice, and in many cases, tragedy. Unlike their brothers Custis, Rooney, and Rob, the Lee daughters never married and left no direct descendants. Their lives were spent primarily in service to their parents and to each other, bound tightly by affection and grief. Annie Carter Lee, born June 18, 1839, was remembered by her family as gentle and affectionate. Her father called her "my gentle Annie." From childhood, she was inseparable from her slightly younger sister Agnes. Together, the two were known in the family simply as the girls, likened by relatives to twin roses on one stem. Annie was also known for her kindness and sense of duty. Before the war, she defied Virginia law by teaching enslaved children at Arlington to read and write, an act that underscored her moral conviction and compassion. The Civil War upended her young life. By 1862, displaced from Arlington, Annie was living with her mother and sisters in North Carolina. In August of that year, she contracted typhoid fever while at White Sulphur Springs. Her condition worsened despite devoted nursing by her mother and Agnes. On October 20th, 1862, Annie died at the age of 23. Her final words were a call for her sister. "Where's Agnes?" A poignant reflection of their bond. General Lee, away with the army, broke down upon receiving the news, writing to his wife that, "To know that I shall never see her again on earth is agonizing in the extreme. Annie was buried in North Carolina, where locals erected a small monument to her memory. In 1994, her remains were reinterred in the Lee family crypt in Lexington, ensuring she rests with her parents and siblings. Eleanor Agnes Lee, born February 27, 1841, was perhaps the most introspective of the Lee children. Known for her intellect and piety, she kept a diary for several years during her girlhood at Arlington. In it, she recorded details of daily life, skating on the frozen canal, birthday celebrations for George Washington, and visits from prominent figures like Washington Irving. Her writings are among the richest primary sources for historians studying the domestic world of the Lee family. Agnes was devastated by Annie's death in 1862. Soon after, she suffered another blow. That Christmas she spent time with her cousin Orton Williams, with whom she was rumoured to be in love. 6 months later, Williams was arrested as a Confederate spy and executed by Union forces. Agnes, still reeling from Annie's loss, withdrew further into sorrow. Though admired by suitors, she never married, devoting her life instead to her parents. In 1870, when her father died, she prepared his body for burial, a final act of devotion. By 1873, her health declined, possibly from typhoid or another intestinal illness. On October 15, 1873, 3 years and 3 days after her father's death, Agnes died at age 32. Her mother, Mary Custis Lee, died just 3 weeks later, overwhelmed by grief. Agnes was buried at Lexington, another life cut short in a family already marked by loss. Mildred Childe Lee, the youngest of the 7, was born February 10, 1846. 16 years younger than Custis, she was nicknamed Precious Life by her parents, later shortened to Life. Mildred grew up in the shadow of her father's military assignments and her mother's declining health. When war came, she was a teenager in boarding school in North Carolina. She soon returned to her family, knitting socks for Confederate soldiers and even attempting to tame a wild squirrel, a story remembered for its glimpse of her gentle and whimsical personality. Mildred was closest to her father in his later years. After Appomattox, she walked with him daily in Lexington, where he served as president of Washington College. She was by his bedside during his fatal illness in 1870. After the deaths of her father, mother, and sister, Agnes, Mildred became the central female figure in the Lee household. She never married, famously remarking that, "To me, he, Robert E. Lee, seems a hero, and all other men small in comparison." Mildred's later years were spent between her brother's homes and in charitable work. She volunteered in her church and organized bazaars for Confederate veterans and widows. In 1887, she traveled abroad, attending Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee and visiting Egypt and France. Yet she always returned to Virginia, where she maintained the family's memory. She died of a stroke on March 27, 1905, in New Orleans, at the age of 59. Confederate veterans honored her with a funeral procession, and she was buried in the Lee Chapel crypt in Lexington. A rare detail about the Lee daughters is their quiet defiance of traditional expectations for women of their class. While none married, each left her own mark. Annie, through her compassion in teaching enslaved children. Agnes, through her writings that preserved Arlington's domestic life. And Mildred, through her dedication to veterans' causes and her role as caretaker of her father's memory. Historians debate whether the daughter's choice, or fate, of remaining unmarried was shaped by personal conviction, grief, or circumstance. Some argue that Annie and Agnes's early deaths prevented marriages that might have taken place, while others suggest that Mildred's devotion to her father left her little desire to seek another man's companionship. What is clear is that the Lee daughters gave their lives to family, duty, and memory rather than to creating households of their own. The collective story of Annie, Agnes, and Mildred underscores the weight of sacrifice in the Lee household. Their lives were not marked by public roles or political achievements, but by private devotion and endurance. They embodied the continuity of family through tragedy, and in their diaries, letters, and quiet acts, they preserved the human face of a household otherwise remembered for its commanding patriarch. Robert Edward Lee Jr., the youngest son of Robert E. Lee and Mary Anna Custis, was born on October 27, 1843, at Arlington House. Known within the family as Rob or Bob, he grew up in the shadows of his older brothers Custis and Rooney. By the time of his birth, his father was already an experienced army officer, often stationed away from home, and his mother's arthritis was beginning to take hold. Rob's early years were thus shaped by a household where older siblings and enslaved caretakers provided much of his day-to-day supervision. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Rob was still a student at the University of Virginia. His mother, already fearful for her other sons who had joined the Confederate Army, urged him to remain in school. But the tide of war swept him in as it had his brothers. By 1862, Rob had enlisted in the Rockbridge Artillery as a private. Later, he was appointed aide-de-camp to his brother Rooney in the cavalry, and before the war ended, he had risen to the rank of captain. One striking story from his military service occurred during the Battle of Antietam in September 1862. Manning an artillery position, Rob was covered in powder and grime when his father rode past without recognizing him. Only when Rob spoke did General Lee realize he was addressing his own son. Lee's response was characteristically restrained. "Yes, my son. Do what you can to drive those people back." The moment revealed the curious dynamic of being both subordinate and son in the midst of battle. Rob fought until the very end of the war. In April 1865, during the Confederate retreat from Petersburg, his horse was shot from under him, and he was separated from the main body of the army. For nearly a month, the Lee family feared he had been killed or captured. Instead, he found his way south and was in Greensboro, North Carolina, when news arrived of his father's surrender at Appomattox. Rob surrendered soon afterward and was paroled. Remarkably, all three of Robert E. Lee's sons survived the war. After 1865, Rob attempted to live quietly as a planter. He inherited Roman's Coke Plantation in King William County, across the Pamunkey River from Rooney's White House estate. Farming during Reconstruction was a struggle, with enslaved labor gone and the Southern economy devastated. Rob nevertheless threw himself into the work, described by contemporaries as humble, practical, and unassuming, qualities that distinguished him from his more public-facing brothers. In 1871, Rob married Charlotte Haxall of Richmond, but their marriage was cut short when she died the following year, reportedly due to complications from a miscarriage. For more than 2 decades, Rob remained a widower. In 1894, at the age of 51, he married Juliet Carter, with whom he had 2 daughters, Anne Carter Lee and Mary Custis Lee. By giving his daughters those names, Rob honored the memory of his late sister Annie and his mother and sister Mary. These daughters extended the Lee family line into the 20th century. Rob also played an important role in preserving his father's memory. In 1904, he published Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee, a compilation of personal anecdotes and his father's private correspondence. The book became a key primary source for historians, offering insight into the general's character, habits, and daily life. Without Rob's careful stewardship, many of these personal details might have been lost. His work placed him at the center of shaping how Robert E. Lee would be remembered by future generations. Rob died on October 19, 1914, in Virginia at the age of 70. By then, only his elder sister, Mary Custis Lee, was still alive. His body was interred at Lexington in the family crypt alongside his parents and siblings. Through his daughters and through Rooney's children, the Lee family line continued. By the 21st century, over 20 direct descendants of Robert E. and Mary Custis Lee could trace their lineage through Rob and Rooney. A lesser-known detail about Rob's later years was his deliberate avoidance of political office or public prominence. Unlike Rooney, who became a congressman, Rob chose private life, focusing on family and farming. This quiet existence reflected his temperament and perhaps his desire to distance himself from the controversies surrounding the Confederacy's memory. He was remembered by those who knew him as modest and approachable, qualities that helped sustain the family's dignity without inflaming public debate. Historians debate the extent to which Rob's memoir shaped the national memory of Robert E. Lee. Some argue that it contributed to the lost cause interpretation by presenting the general as a noble, apolitical figure, detached from the Confederacy's defense of slavery. Others maintain that Rob's intention was simply to honor his father, not to participate in ideological battles. Regardless, his book has remained an essential resource for scholars and the public alike. The legacy of Robert E. Lee's children today rests on both tangible and intangible contributions. Custis left his mark in education and law through Washington and Lee University and his Supreme Court case. Rooney bridged the gap between Confederate officer and U.S. congressman, ensuring the continuation of the Lee family line. Annie, Agnes, and Mildred exemplified sacrifice, devotion, and memory, though they left no descendants. Mary's travels and her 1902 arrest highlighted her independence and eccentric defiance of social norms. Rob preserved the family's personal history and extended its legacy through his daughters. Together, the 7 children illustrate the complexities of life after the Civil War for one of America's most famous families. Their lives spanned from the height of the antebellum South to the threshold of the modern 20th century. They carried forward both the burdens and the privileges of their father's name, leaving behind a story that continues to attract historical attention. The 7 children of Robert E. Lee lived through one of the most turbulent passages in American history. Born into the privilege of Arlington House, they inherited both the Washington and Lee names, and with them, the weight of expectation. The Civil War destroyed their home, scattered their lives, and left each to find a path forward in the ruins of the Old South. Their stories were not those of uniform triumph or despair, but of endurance, adaptation, and legacy. George Washington Custis Lee upheld the family's intellectual and institutional role, leading Washington College and winning the Supreme Court case that defined Arlington's legal fate. William Henry Fitzhugh Lee embodied resilience, surviving devastating wartime losses to rebuild a family and serve as a U.S. congressman. Robert E. Lee, Jr. lived quietly but preserved his father's memory for future generations through his writings. The 3 daughters, Annie, Agnes, and Mildred, each gave their strength to family devotion, with Annie and Agnes dying young and Mildred carrying their memory into the new century. Mary Custis Lee lived longest, embracing independence and world travel, even becoming an unlikely figure of defiance in segregated Virginia. A common thread unites their stories. None escaped the shadow of their father, and each bore the consequences of his fame and the Confederacy's defeat. Yet their lives also reveal a broader truth about 19th century America. They illustrate how one prominent Southern family navigated the transition from antebellum gentry to Reconstruction, from the ashes of war to the modern world. Today, Arlington House stands preserved as a national memorial, overlooking the graves of thousands in Arlington National Cemetery. Washington and Lee University continues to educate, though its association with the Lee name remains debated. Descendants of Robert E. Lee live quietly across the United States, their presence a reminder that history's legacies endure not only in monuments and books, but also in families who carry forward names once at the center of national conflict. The story of Lee's children is not simply an epilogue to his life. It is the continuation of a legacy that bridged the past and the present, binding private lives to the currents of American history.